Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today we're going to be talking about failure. Failure is one of those things that we have to deal with as humans that is very, very difficult sometimes to deal with. You might think of some times in your life where you experienced failure. Maybe it was in trying to accomplish a particular goal that you had set for yourself. And maybe because of procrastination or outside things that you had no control over, you just were not able to accomplish that goal and you failed. Or maybe there's times that you feel like you failed others. They expected something from you and you failed to deliver. Maybe it had to do with temptation or a sin in your life that maybe you've had a few victories here and there, but ultimately you always seem to end up in failure. These can be some very frustrating times in our lives, and this can be very disappointing times in our lives. And it's important for us to understand that failure is going to come. None of us are perfect. None of us get it right every time. And so, given that, I think it is worth our time to examine how it is that we should deal with failure when it does come. Joshua was a person who had to deal with failure. And probably in a way that most of us will never even come close to experiencing. You see, Joshua had just gotten done with a great victory over Jericho. They followed the Lord's leading and marched around the city, blew the trumpets, they shouted, and the walls came down. They overtook it and burned the city and completely overtook Jericho, even though it was a fortified city. And this was a great victory. And this was something that kind of, if he wasn't already established as the leader of Israel, this really did establish him as the leader. And so the people have had a taste of victory. They know what it's like to have victory through the Lord. But then, when it comes to Ai, which was a very much smaller place and wasn't one that they weren't even that concerned about, they only sent 3,000 people out to it to attack it. They actually fail at overcoming this small little city. And so think about you as Joshua, the leader of millions of people, and you fail to overcome this little city. Think about how that would reflect on you. Think about how that would reflect on your leadership and how you might be afraid, how people might view your own ability to lead the people into this task that God had placed before them. Well, Joshua doesn't deal with this failure very well. As a matter of fact, what he gives us is actually a good example of what not to do when we experience failure in our lives. One thing that he does here when he brings it to the Lord is he kind of over-exaggerates the situation. He says in verse 9 of chapter 7, it says, "For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and they will surround us and cut off our name from the earth." Okay, so they lost one battle, and here Joshua is just basically throwing in the towel saying, look, they're going to cut us off and cut our name off from the earth. We're basically doomed. And so he's over-exaggerating the situation. God is still their God. He could remember back the times when they were very successful under the leadership of Moses. He could just remember not too long ago when they overcame Jericho. And so all was not lost. But to Joshua it felt as though it was, because he had experienced this failure. Sometimes when we fail, as Joshua does here, we might tend to blame God. Blame God for our failures. Earlier in verse 7, it says, Joshua said, "Alas, O Lord, why did you ever bring this people over the Jordan only to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites?" It's basically saying, Lord, you led us over here. You promised us that we're going to take over the land. And all you did was bring us over to deliver us over to the hand of the Amorites. And he's basically blaming God for his failure. And that can be a temptation for us sometimes, especially if it's something that we worked hard at. Maybe it's something that we feel like God has called us to do, and we really stepped out in faith to do something, and when we when we are engaged in that activity and we find that we actually fail at whatever it is that we're trying to do, we might look up to God and say, God, why did you even call me to do this? Why did you even lead me in this direction if I was just going to fail? Sometimes we can push the blame on ourselves and make ourselves feel guilty, or sometimes we can push the blame onto God. And of course, that is not a good way to respond to failure. Sometimes we can question maybe what God is doing in our lives because of it, as implied in the verse I just read. We might think, well, God, I really felt like this was something that you were wanting me to do. This can definitely be true of people who are involved in ministry, involved in preaching, or other types of works for the Lord, and things don't quite go the way that they would want them to go. You might begin to say, God, I thought this was what you wanted for my life. I really felt this was where I was supposed to go, and this is where I was supposed to be. And so we could question God's calling in our lives, or we might even question God's power. God, surely if you were powerful enough, you could keep me from failure. You could keep me from what I just experienced. Yes, I know I expect myself to fail. In and of myself, I am weak. I am incapable of doing things perfectly. But God, you are my strength. You're the one that I trust in. How could you lead me into failure? And then also we sometimes deal with failure by being concerned about what other people think. What's it going to look like when they hear about the fact that I failed at whatever it is I failed at? He goes in verse 9, for the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and they will surround us and cut off our name. He was concerned about them hearing about it. And a lot of times it's our pride, it's our ego. I'm not saying that was the case with Joshua, but sometimes our pride and our ego will make us worried about what other people think. It's not so much that we failed or that we didn't accomplish what we were trying to do, but we just don't want people to look down on us. Especially if we have been very vocal about the fact that, hey, we really feel like this is what God is leading us to do. And people know that you stepped out on faith, trusting in the Lord, and then it fails. What's that going to look like to everyone else? And so these are just some ways that we might deal with failure in our lives in the wrong way. And Joshua, again, gives us a good example of that. And we know that the Lord is not pleased with his response to this failure, because in verse 10, this is what the Lord says, and this is good advice for us as well. It says, so the Lord said to Joshua, rise up. That's the first thing we must do, rise up. Quit the pity party, stop moping, stop saying, oh, woe is me, I can't believe I messed up, I can't believe everything ended up like this. And with our head down and our feet dragging, whenever we experience failure, the first thing we need to do is rise up. That is, get up. Break the cycle of despondency, depression, whatever it is that can't come out of that failure, guilt, and rise up. Rise up, rise up, break the cycle, get out of that bad frame of mind. But then also we need to then look for the root of whatever it was that caused the failure. After he says rise up, he says, why is it that you have fallen on your face? Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. And so the Lord gives Joshua the reason for his failure. And that's what we need to do, is we need to rise up, and then we need to begin to research, why is it that I experienced this failure? And there might be a lot of different reasons. In Joshua's case, it was because of sin in the camp. And that is something that we should consider as well. Is there something that we're doing that is outside of God's will? And God's trying to point us to that and trying to bring that out of us. We need to do some self-examining. Or it might be some other reason. Whatever the reason is for the failure, we need to do the best we can to try to figure out what it was so that we can bring it before the Lord and hopefully correct it. And that brings us to the last thing that we need to do, and that is we need to take action. Uh, One of the things that we might want to do when we experience failure is we want to give up, we want to check out, and we don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. But what the Lord was calling Joshua to do is not only recognize what the problem was, but to actually get up, take action, and take care of what it was. And in this case, it was Achan, and they had to go through this process of figuring out that it was him, and then they had to stone his family and burn them and completely do away with the whole situation. When they did that, then they were able to have victory over Ai. But they had to take action. And if we don't take action, we can stay in a rut. We can stay stuck where we are for the rest of our lives if we let it. And of course, we don't want that to happen. So these are just some things to think about. Maybe you've experienced failure recently, or you can think of times in the past that you have. But I will guarantee you that in the future, at some point, you're going to experience failure again. And so these things can be helpful, hopefully, as you do embark on those failures. But with that, I thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you guys have a great day. Have a great Sunday. I love you guys. God bless.